Hello, and welcome to the Evelyn Y. Davis studios at the National Press Foundation. It's been more than a year since Me Too entered the national lexicon, and during that time, the political and media worlds have been upended. From members of Congress, to would-be members of Congress, to big-name reporters and anchors, the number of prominent media and political leaders outed for their behavior has grown steadily. And many of those cases came to light because of investigative efforts of reporters, such as the ones we're going to talk with today. The National Press Foundation is a nonprofit dedicated to helping journalists cover complex topics with depth and accuracy. We serve journalists in the U.S. and around the world. I'm Chris Adams, Director of Training at the National Press Foundation. The topic today, covering sexual harassment, and how journalists can find sources to execute stories on the topic. Many of these stories are the very definition of he said, she said. Many are also years or even decades old. So how do reporters vet those stories as well as the women telling them? How do they guard against faulty memories or even attempts to intentionally plant false stories? I'm joined by two reporters who broke two of the biggest stories on the sexual harassment front in 2017. Both worked for the Washington Post, although the stories they unearthed were very different. Beth Reinhard helped expose the actions of failed Alabama Senate candidate Roy Moore, who pursued teenage girls when he was in his early 30s. The stories won a Pulitzer Prize. Amy Brittain helped expose prominent CBS and PBS anchor Charlie Rose, who had for years engaged in crude and inappropriate behavior around young women who worked with him or were applying to do so. We'll also take questions from you, our viewers. Tweet them at NatPress. So, Amy and Beth, welcome. Thank you very much for coming to do this.
Thank you.
Thank you. We want to talk about investigating sexual harassment and the issues around it and the unique complexities that are posed by trying to investigate these kinds of stories. But first, I'd like to get a sense from each of you, had you done this kind of reporting before? Beth, you've been at the Post since 2017. Previously, you were at the Wall Street Journal, the Miami Herald, and the National Journal. You've done a lot of political work, and the Roy Moore stories we're going to talk about won a Pulitzer. But had you ever really investigated sexual harassment issues before?
I would say much more superficially, never to this extent. I mean, I've covered a lot of campaigns, a lot of candidates, and done a lot of, sort of background research, digging into their backgrounds, but this was an unusual case.
Okay. And Amy, you've been at the Post since 2013. Before that, we're at the Star-Ledger in New Jersey. You've been part of a team of Post reporters who won the Pulitzer for coverage of police shootings, and you won the George Polk Award for coverage of steroid abuse by police officers in New Jersey. Had you ever done sexual harassment stories before?
No, absolutely not. This is my very first time tackling this issue.
Okay, so tell us about those stories. Maybe Amy, you get started. Tell me a little bit about the story. So this is about Charlie Rose.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me how it came about. Where did the story idea first come from? Then how did you actually start to execute it?
Sure. So the New York Times and the New Yorker broke the story of sexual harassment and sexual misconduct by Harvey Weinstein in October of last year. And after those stories came out, I think that there was a general sense that this was a time where perhaps more of these stories were going to be coming to light. Erin Carmone had been a freelancer for the Washington Post and had previously, when she worked for Jezebel, heard some rumors about Charlie Rose's behavior back in the year 2010. She tried to chase the story back then, was unable to get anyone to kind of return her phone calls, but she had kept her notes and kept her emails about some of the initial leads that she had about Charlie's behavior. And in the aftermath of the Harvey Weinstein story, she brought the pitch to the Washington Post, and some of the top editors got in a room, and I wasn't aware of this at this moment, but decided that I would be the one that they would pair with her to try to pursue the story. So we joined together on November 3rd, went over some of the initial information that she had heard, and kind of made a game plan for reporting, and we ended up publishing the story on November 20th. So it was a 17-day process with the two of us together, virtually nonstop chasing these allegations.
So when she came to the Post to say, I had these notes from 2010, I'd like to pursue the story again, had she started to make some inquiries to see if some of the people from 2010 might be willing to talk now, or
She
Okay.
had,
So she had a
and
sense it could
she
be
had
opened
an
up.
initial sense that perhaps there was some more willingness to tell the story now. And when she got that sense, she knew that as a freelancer, she needed the backing of an institution to pursue a story of this nature. She needed legal protection. She needed the editors of a place like the Washington Post, and thankfully, she brought it to us. And when they paired us together, I was brought in as the investigative reporter, but this was very much a true partnership from start to finish. And, we started looking at the initial notes from 2010 and made a reporting game plan to try to figure out, A, if these allegations were true, and if they were true, how we could corroborate them and kind of broaden the reporting circle to see if this was a pattern of behavior by Charlie.
Okay, and just to remind our viewers, the 30-second version, I mean, what was the pattern of behavior? What was
Right.
Charlie Rose doing that you're writing
Right.
about?
So we had 8 women in our story. 3 were on the record, 5 were anonymous, detailing allegations of sexual harassment and groping. The extent of the behavior was groping their genital areas, their buttocks, walking in front of them naked in some cases, making lewd sexual remarks to them, lewd sexual phone calls in some cases.
Okay. So Beth, let's tell us about the Roy Moore stories. So first of all, kind of remind our viewers what these stories entailed. It's been, I guess, 10 months or so since those stories came out. So tell us how you got on the story, and give us the sense of what the stories showed.
So Roy Moore was the Republican nominee in Alabama for Senate. He was one of the most well-known figures in Alabama. He was a judge who was on the Supreme Court, had attracted a lot of controversy, was revered among evangelical Christians in Alabama. And my reporting partner, Stephanie McCrummen, who's actually an Alabama native, was in Alabama doing some reporting, not squarely on Roy Moore, but about the Christian community that supports him. And he started hearing these stories that he had pursued young girls when he had just been starting out in his career as an assistant district attorney. And so she started to make some contacts with the women and quickly got the sense that this was a lot to sort of wrap her arms around. And so the team that I'm on, the investigative team, sent me down to Alabama to meet up with her and help her chase these allegations.
And so she was a political reporter doing political stories.
She's actually not really a political
Okay.
reporter. She was doing sort of almost more of a feature story. Really, that's my background as a political reporter, but this really was not a political story. It was
Right.
really just, an investigative story or whatever you want to call it, just, reaching out to people, trying to persuade people to go on the record, and looking at public records and in some cases to corroborate information we were getting from them.
So I was struck when I'm just pulling up your story right here. You noted that you were, while reporting a story in Alabama about supporters of Moore's Senate campaign, a Post reporter heard that Moore allegedly had sought relationships with teenage girls. So I think you were very upfront with the readers out there to say, we were just basically, pursuing a kind of a, routine coverage for a Senate race, and we heard about this thing, because there's often an allegation that the media is going after somebody or going fishing for something.
Right.
And that wasn't the case here.
That was deliberate. Even the name of this movement, Me Too, actually doesn't really apply to this story because these women did not raise their hand and come willingly or running to the newspaper. In fact, they were very reluctant to share their stories for lots of reasons. I think the movement sort of encompasses both of those kinds of stories. Sometimes women are moved to come forward inspired, as they were after the Weinstein stories came to light. In other cases, these have been hidden for years and years, and for lots of reasons, women are uncomfortable about talking about these experiences.
Okay. So you had the initial story, you had follow-up stories over the next couple of weeks, and one of those is a particularly interesting, bizarre story about somebody trying to sting you, and you guys basically reverse stinging them, or I'm not exactly
Right.
sure how to phrase it. So we'll get to that in a second. And your stories, you came out with a big bop big pop in October of last year, or no, I'm sorry, November of last year, and then there were a flurry of follow-up stories right then. But then you came back several months later with another big story, and so we're going to watch a video clip of that. I mean, this is the follow-up story that came out on May 3rd of this year, and we have a video clip from NBC addressing your story. So let's watch that clip.
Welcome to CBS This Morning.
Today, CBS This Morning anchor Gayle King once again found herself responding to new allegations against former co-host Charlie Rose.
I feel sick to my stomach, and I don't know what to say about this.
The Washington Post reporting that 27 additional women have come forward accusing Rose of sexual misconduct over the last 40 years.
When the story first broke, I said Charlie was my friend. I still consider him a friend. That said, this is very troubling, very disturbing, and you can't discount what these women are saying.
The article says both the current and former executive producers of CBS This Morning were made aware of Rose's inappropriate behavior.
Okay, so that's how. That was a description of your stories and kind of the aftermath of it. So tell us a little bit more about what did that story show that the initial story from November of 17 hadn't shown?
Right. Well, when we were doing our initial reporting, it was focused on Charlie's behavior at his own program, which is, it aired on PBS, and he was his own boss. There was no human resources department. Essentially Charlie was where the buck stopped, and if you had a complaint, you went to Charlie or you went to his executive producer. So in the aftermath of that story, our phones were ringing off the hook, so many voicemails, emails, and people were reaching out to say that they had experienced this behavior when he was at CBS, even before his recent years at CBS when he had worked on a program called Night Watch in the 1980s. So we got a sense that this behavior had continued in a way that went much, much further back than we realized in our initial reporting. I think in our first story we dated it back to the 90s. In the second story, we dated it back to the late 1970s. So it was really quite a reporting journey when one day you're on the phone speaking to a woman who's in her mid-60s who experienced this behavior from Charlie at the beginning of her career, and then the next day you're on the phone with a 24-year-old who experienced this behavior in 2016 and 2017. And that gives you a sense that this was a more than 40-year scope of behavior. And for us, it was really important to dig into how this behavior was allowed to persist and even thrive for so long in the environment of CBS and PBS.
Okay, so as I said, we're going to be taking questions from people on Twitter, and I'll work these in as soon as I can. So we have one from a reporter out there. And I'm just going to toss that out to the two of you. It's kind of addressed to whomever. I left the Anniston Star when editors tried to spike a story on the company's owner, former publisher, sexually assaulting reporters. Story was later published. He stepped down and one editor left the paper. I'm still not back in journalism. Any advice for others facing the similar situation? How do you deal with an internal case? When I saw this question come in, I actually did some quick checking and found this story about the Anniston Star publisher. It was, covered in Alabama media. It was also covered. There was somebody at the Post wrote about it also. But I guess the question is, do you have any advice for reporters about how to handle something internal in your own news organization, which I know is not the case for you guys?
Yeah, I spoke to a newsroom recently in DC that this newsroom experienced this. One of the organization's co-founders and top executive was accused of sexual harassment, and they were really still reckoning with it inside the newsroom. And when I was talking with the employees, I got the sense that they were still dealing with this because the full extent of his behavior had never actually been published or exposed. He stepped aside amid rumors, and I encouraged them, even though it was difficult, to pursue the reporting themselves, and hopefully they would have the backing of the editorial staff within their newsroom to go after that story, because in order to get beyond a situation as an organization, I think you need to have a full understanding and accounting of exactly the extent of the behavior.
Okay. All right, so let's talk about the reporting that's involved. Your two stories are different. There's some core similarities, but there's some pretty big differences between them also. One's in the media world, one's in the political world. One is about actions from 35 years ago. One is 40 years ago, all the way up through current. So there's kind of different issues at play. I was hoping, you could tell us, and therefore tell the reporters out there who might be covering these kind of stories, to talk about, the main question: how do you approach women or men who have stories to tell along these lines? How did you get the people that were in your story to open up, and in some cases to go on the record, which is always a tricky thing? Maybe Beth, if you could talk first about
Sure.
that.
So, we had multiple conversations with each woman who we wrote about. It wasn't like, wham, bam, one interview on the record, we're done. It was a series of interviews. Some we did together with my reporting partner, Stephanie McCrummon. Some we did on our own, but it was multiple times. And so the women got more comfortable with us. We got more comfortable with them. There were a lot of off-the-record conversations. In some cases, we weren't even taking notes, just so these people can feel a little more at ease. And then, of course, once they were ready to go on the record, then there was, of course, careful note-taking. But I think the multiple interviews helps if you have the time, if you have the luxury of time, and you don't in certain stories. That makes sure that the story you're getting is consistent, which is important, and also gives the source time to feel comfortable, and for you to also have comfort in that person's credibility.
And were your interviews generally all in person, or a mixture of phone and person?
Anyone who was in Alabama that we could meet in person, we met in person. There were a couple people who were, living in different states, so that had to be done over the phone. But I think interviewing in person makes a big difference if it's possible.
And what was your reaction? I mean, were they totally surprised to get a call from a Washington Post reporter wanting to ask about something that happened in 1979 or 1980?
I think they were surprised, maybe not as surprised if the Weinstein stories had not just come out. So there was a lot of discussion about this. This was something that these women had thought about a great deal over the years. This happened to them when they were teenagers. They were growing up in a small town in the South, and now they're mature women. Some of them are grandparents. And they have a much different view of Roy Moore's behavior now than they did then. And it was something they had come back to during their lives. And Lee Korfman, who was sort of the center of the story, had thought very seriously about coming forward when Roy Moore had run for office before, or when he was up for judgeships. But she just never was able to go through with it.
Okay. So Amy, tell me about your experiences. You told, when we were talking ahead of time, you said, this is not the kind of situation where you can convince somebody to go on the record. I mean, why not? I mean, what's the line between persuading or hoping somebody ends up on the record versus, I guess not trying or just taking them off the record?
I think that Aren and I realized early on that this was ultimately a decision that, as much as we wanted to will it and believe it into existence to get these women to the place where they could go on the record, that we were not going to make that decision, and that decision did not rest with us, it rested with them. And I think that a lot of times in talking about these stories, we get asked, how do you convince people to go on the record or get them there? And you can, as a reporter, do everything you can to stress that the importance of the credibility of the story rests on, named women and named witnesses within the story. But ultimately, it's their story to tell. And Aren and I fully respected that. And in some cases, we had very, very difficult, emotional conversations with women who in some ways felt like they would be letting us down if they didn't go on the record. But Aren and I never felt that way. This is a decision that we knew would in some ways be attached to them for the rest of their lives. I mean, we're living in the Google age. And if you're in a story like this, that's an explosive story, it's going to be a result that's attached to your name forever. So all we could do was kind of talk to them about the different scenarios that could possibly play out. I know that one woman that I was talking to just about every day, initially she wasn't ready to do it, but she kept telling me, every day we would talk and she would say, well, I'm not ready today. And she never completely shut the door on it. And I asked her, kind of what was keeping the crack in the door open for her. And ultimately, about 48 hours before publication, she did decide to go on the record. And she told me that the difference for her was that the only reason to not do it would be out of fear of Charlie, and she had lived in fear of Charlie for nearly a decade, and she was tired of living her life afraid of him.
And once she decided to go on the record, did the fact that she was now an on-the-record source, did that elevate her in the story, or did you end up giving more of her story in the piece because she was a named source than not?
We did. Yeah, she ended up being the lead quote in the story, and I believe her quote was something along the lines of, her name is Rhea Bravo. If you wanna search for it and read it, it's a pretty powerful quote.
Right.
I
it's
think
taken 10 years and a fierce moment of cultural reckoning for me to understand these moments for what they were. He was a sexual predator, and I was his victim.
Right. And ultimately, since she was on the record, we were also able to give her additional opportunities to reflect on the nature of their interactions. Some of Rhea's interactions with Charlie happened, at Charlie's Long Island estate, and some readers may not understand why a young woman would go out alone with Charlie to his property. And I think that for these women who were in these situations, they were young. In some cases, they were interns who were making very little. And a star of his nature, if he says, I want you to work at my property, I want you to work with me for the weekend, they felt in some ways forced to do that. And because they were on the record, they were able to explain kind of how they were thinking about that situation and ultimately some of the regrets that they had.
Okay. So I guess this is for you. I mean, you ended up, your first story was 8 women, 3 on the record. Mm-hmm. Going in, did you and your editors have any thresholds for kind of what level of proof, what number of sources, what number of named sources you would want or you would need to make the story go?
Mm-hmm. No one would give us a definitive rubric or some type of matrix to figure it out going in. I think there was just an understanding that when we knew, everyone would collectively know. Mm-hmm. And that can be sometimes a little bit of a frustrating process as a reporter when you have sources saying, what does it take, what's going to get you there. I remember in November, I remember this moment very clearly because Arin and I were eating lunch together in a conference room, and we saw that Beth and Stephanie's story had been published. And we were stunned, obviously, like a lot of people, reading it from top to bottom. And seeing their story and having it come out, in the middle of our reporting process actually really did help us with sources, because we were able to say, look, this is the quality and the caliber of work that's expected from our team. If you read the story is bulletproof, and this is what we need our story to be. So it actually served as a really good model for us in the reporting and writing process.
Okay. So the need for it to be bulletproof, I wanted to ask you about that, Beth. When we were talking ahead of time, you were talking about the vetting process and how you vet these stories, how you vet the sources of these stories. You told me if you get a detail wrong, the name of a street, saying a restaurant served wine when it didn't, that's the kind of detail people will use to tear down the story. So I was hoping you could explain the vetting process, particularly vetting a story that took place 35 years ago, and it was coming from the memory of somebody who was a teenager at the time. I mean, how did you go about doing that?
Right. So, these kind of stories often are sort of dismissed as he said, she said stories. And as reporters, it's on us to try to move beyond that, to see what we can do to corroborate the story, the details that the woman is giving you, or the man in some cases. So, ideally, someone who's coming to you and telling you a story about sexual misconduct, told someone else at the time, ideally, or maybe later, and or maybe multiple people. So you can then call those people and ask them what they remember. And I, would caution in those interviews that you go into them clean. Like, you don't say, "Do you remember this?" You just say, "Tell me what you remember about what so-and-so told you all those years ago," so that you're getting an unvarnished story, and you want to make sure that those details match up. Another thing we did was, in some cases, we were able to use public records. For example, Lee Korfman, the woman at the center of the story, recalled how she met Roy Moore when she was 14, and she was at the courthouse for a custody hearing. And so we did pull those records to see, was there a hearing at, this month and this year? And she didn't remember the exact date, but, could we place this in time? And we were even able to figure out, like, Roy Moore's office was on, where was his office in the courthouse? So those kind of details, I think, help bulletproof the story. They protect everyone. They protect the source, they protect the reporter, they protect the newspaper. In another case, you mentioned the wine.
Yeah.
A woman had told us about Roy Moore taking her out for dinner to a restaurant that served a certain rosé. And so we went to that restaurant to make sure they did in fact serve wine. Did you serve wine in 1979 or whatever year it was? Because had we run the story and someone could have come back and said, wait a minute, they didn't have a liquor license, that would have been very damaging. And so I think as reporters, we're trained to build a story on the strength of details. Like, do you remember what you were wearing? Do you remember what the weather was like? All of these things add credibility to the story, especially if they're telling a story that happened 40 years ago. But then, to the best of your ability, you have to be able to fact check those things. What was the weather on October 2nd?
Right.
And if there are any discrepancies, then that's the kind of thing you want to get a handle on before the story runs.
Right, and there was a fact that was kind of called into question, but it wasn't from one of the women that you guys had written about.
Right.
So you guys wrote your story, and then there became there's a big media buzz about it, and
Right.
then a prominent attorney found another woman and brought her forward.
Right.
And in that case, then there became a big story about whether this yearbook that she was showing with the signature in it was valid or not.
Right. And that goes to exactly my point. Like, if they had come clean about, how she had altered the yearbook right from the get-go, I think that would have helped her stand up better than once that came out later. That was used, as I said, to tear down the entire story. And I think, you have to be prepared, because these stories are explosive, that people are going to come back and attack you, attack the women that you're writing about. Everyone needs to be prepared for that. And part of that preparation is saying, like, tell me everything so that we know everything in advance. And so the vetting is not just of the details of the story they're telling you, but also their own backgrounds. We don't want to find out after the fact that you worked for Roy Moore's opponent, or that you had some kind of argument with Roy Moore's family that you didn't tell us about. So we told the women, like, we need to know all your skeletons, and that's to protect you and to protect the story. And so we put them through sort of the same kind of rigorous background checks that we put candidates through. Not because that would necessarily bear on the relevance of their story, but just because we needed to know everything that was out there, and whether there was anything in their background that would shed doubt on whether they were truthful.
How did they take that? I'm looking at the paragraph in your story about Leah Korfman, and it's describing why she hadn't shared the story before. She did. As the years went on, Korfman says she did not share her story about Moore, partly because of the trouble in her life. She has had 3 divorces and financial problems, and it talks about three bankruptcy cases that she and her husband were involved with. Talks about a time she paid a fine for driving a boat without lights, and for a time in 2010 she was charged with a misdemeanor for selling beer to a minor. That charge was dismissed. So you have 2 paragraphs kind of laying out this woman that we're bringing forth as a witness to this
Right.
Senate candidate has a lot of stuff in her background.
Right. So that was a decision we made very carefully. We did the background checks on all of the women. We decided to include those details about Lee because her story was she was really making the most serious allegation, that he had essentially sexually molested her. And unfortunately, as we know from experience, what happens in these cases is someone tells their story, and then the critics come roaring back with whatever dirt they can find on that person and often distort that dirt. So what we were envisioning is if we wrote this story and didn't mention anything about the bankruptcies or these very minor misdemeanors, that somehow the reaction would include, oh, she's a crook, and a total exaggeration. So we just made the decision, and we talked about this with her obviously ahead of time, so she wasn't surprised. We're just going to put this out there because then we know that they can't come back with anything new.
Right.
We're acknowledging that you have not lived an unblemished life. We're not saying that these blemishes have anything to do with the story you're telling about Roy Moore. But the story kind of rises and falls on the credibility of these victims. And so I think as reporters, we have to do everything we can to insulate them from those kind of attacks. And that was the way we decided to handle it in that case. And we made it clear to her that we're not doing this to embarrass you, but we're just doing it in some ways just so all our cards are on the table, so to speak.
And did the women in either of your stories, did they ever, pull back their support or their participation in the story once they kind of realized that you would be poking around in their business on things not directly related to Charlie Rose?
I mean, once they kind of made the decision to come forward, I mean, they knew that accusing a prominent man like this, that there would be repercussions. So they were prepared for, social media attacks and that sort of thing. And so that goes to what Amy was saying about, the persuasion. They have to be invested. This has to be their decision because this is not going to be an easy path coming forward in many cases, unfortunately. So if someone feels backed into a corner or talked into it, I mean, that's not going to go well once the story publishes and things start to get really uncomfortable. Right. And I also think in this case, these are women who felt, taken advantage of and a loss of power. And so when you as a reporter tell them, like, this is your decision, I think that in a way is both a reporting strategy and also something that helps them understand that it's their decision and their call. And once they make that decision, here's what may happen.
Okay, so I just want to go back to kind of the what was going on, in the country at the time. This was a huge story in 2017. It had kind of started before that, and I guess it was 2016 with Fox News boss Roger Ailes was caught up in sexual harassment issues, and then in 2017, Fox host Bill O'Reilly, and then Harvey Weinstein kind of came along, and I think that was in September of last year. During the next couple of months, they were kind of like disclosure after disclosure, and yours and the Roy Moore and the Charlie Rose stories kind of came in the midst of that. Could you maybe talk a little? You touched on this before, but the fact that the story was now out there, the story in general was out there, how much of an impact did that have on your ability to do these two stories?
I mean, I'll give the Times and the New Yorker a lot of credit. I mean, I think that there was a sense that some type of wall had been broken down. And I'm not sure, if you look in history, if you look at the Bill Cosby story that came out a couple of years before, it didn't necessarily have the same impact as making more people feel empowered to come forward. I'm not sure exactly why it was that moment at that time, but I do think that it made an impact. And, as reporters, certainly, some people might view them as our competition, but I know that I was grateful because I felt like that the work that they were doing was powerful and it made an impact and it made a difference in the ability of other women perhaps to come forward in certain cases.
Okay.
I mean, I think the other sort of thing that we'll look back on in history and wonder how it influenced all of this was also the Trump campaign, because you had a procession of women coming forward in the final couple months of that campaign, and then he's elected president of the United States. And I think that maybe in some ways these stories were a little bit of a reaction to that. In some ways, I think they pushed women underground because I think people saw it doesn't matter if you come forward. the guy's still going to get elected president. And in other ways, I think it inspired women. So I think all of this was sort of churning at that time.
Okay, so tell me a little bit more about the competitiveness, the competitive pressures on this story. I mean, you said that, your story was telegraphed in 17 days, and you said that you had heard that there were 6 different publications pursuing the same story. So, I mean, was anybody else on the trail of your particular story?
So obviously we knew a lot of people were looking at Roy Moore.
Yeah.
But as we made contact with the women, we got to know them pretty quickly, and I guess had said knew that if they were contacted by other reporters, they would let us know.
Yeah.
And so we had a little bit of a level of comfort because we knew that we were the only people talking to these women. That could have changed at any time. So it was stressful, but it wasn't that we were competing with the New York Times to get this one person to talk to us, because the New York Times ostensibly didn't know about the women that we had found.
Okay, but your case was different. I mean, you tripped across sources who had been contacted by other publications, right?
We did. We did.
Describe what was going through your minds at the time.
We did. I mean, Erin and myself, I think we made kind of a pact between the two of us that any moment that we were worried about the competition or let our minds wander about, what some other publication was doing, we were going to try to refocus and rechannel that energy into our own work, because we knew that that was a wasted minute if we were worried about the competition. And that's very mentally challenging to do that and to be disciplined enough to where you can actually try to refocus that energy in a productive way. And it takes a really dedicated partner to kind of keep you on track. And Erin and I were able to do that for each other and provide that kind of accountability check. But it was difficult because I would say every day we we heard that another outlet was on the story or that another outlet had called someone else. And we didn't know at the time how many women that Charlie had done this to. It wasn't like we knew that there was just our universe of 8 women. I mean, we had a pretty strong sense that there were definitely more women out there. But we did feel like we were in the position to tell the story in the most powerful way, and we wanted to be the ones to do it.
Okay, so let's talk about how you told the stories. I'm struck by you both had 2 really powerfully reported investigative stories, but your writing approach was different. And you went with a straight news lead, you went with an anecdotal lead. I want to read your lead and bits of your lead, and I was hoping you could just tell me why you chose to go the way you did. Because investigative reporters out there always have to grapple with how do I approach a story? Is the anecdotal way right? So from the Charlie Rose story, 8 women have told the Washington Post that longtime television host Charlie Rose made unwanted sexual advances toward them, including lewd phone calls, walking around naked in their presence, or groping their breasts, buttocks, or genital areas. So hard news story, or hard news lead, and a couple more paragraphs on kind of the big picture, and then a long response from Charlie Rose, which had, I guess, come in 24 hours before or something like that. Your story is Lee Corfman. Lee Corfman says she was 14 years old when an older man approached her outside a courtroom in Etowah County, Alabama. She was sitting on a wooden bench with her mother, they both recall, when the man introduced himself as Roy Moore. It was early 1979, and Moore, now the Republican nominee in Alabama for U.S. Senate seat, was a 32-year-old assistant district attorney. He struck up a conversation, Corfman and her mother say, and offered to watch the girl while her mother went inside for a child custody hearing. He said, "Oh, you don't want to go in there and hear all that. I'll stay out here with her," says Corfman's mother, Nancy Wells, 71. "I thought, how nice of him to want to take care of my little girl." And then a couple paragraphs later, you have the nut graph. 3 other women interviewed by the Washington Post in recent weeks say Moore pursued them when they were between the ages of 16 and 18, and he was in his early 30s. So, Amy, first, if you could maybe tell me, how did you choose the approach you went with, and then I'll ask you the same thing.
I believe, actually, we first tried to do an anecdotal lead because the Roy Moore story had come out first, and we thought, oh, well, that's a really compelling way to get into a story. Let's see if we can try to structure the top of ours where it's 3 or 4 paragraphs about one woman's experience, and then you go into the broader story. We tried it and it didn't work for a couple of reasons, because there were a lot of nuances and details that we needed to get into the top in order to make the reader explain kind of why this was important. And I think in the lead that Beth used, I mean, it's a relatively simple story, and what we were trying to do at the top initially was not simple. And I think that with the editor's input, and I think Erin and I also realized this, the best way to get into that story was just to go with the striking, shocking detail of what he had done to these women, because his behavior was so shocking. I mean, walking around naked, groping their body parts, you know, and we felt like this straightforward lead was really powerful. We had a great copy editor who, I think a couple of hours before the story was published, suggested one small tweak to the lead. I believe in the initial version we had, in a way, described the groping of like private areas. And in our story, we felt like it was really important to be specific, not gratuitous, but specific in all cases, if possible, because we didn't want to give the readers a different impression. We didn't want them to think that it was less than what had happened, and we didn't want them to think that it was more than what had happened. And the copy editor said, well, why don't we change, you know, this kind of vague private areas description and actually just say, you know, that he groped their breasts, their buttocks, and their genital areas. And that was what we ended up going with, and I think that we felt strongly about the decision to do it, and we felt like it was a powerful way into the story.
Okay. And Beth, how you took a different approach. Describe your thought process.
Right. So as soon as Lee Korfman, you know, shared this part of the story, and then Stephanie, my partner McCrummen, was the one who interviewed the mom and got that quote. I mean, it was like we knew right away that was the lead. It was just so compelling, and it just, sometimes when you're reporting a story, like one anecdote just sort of rises up as I mean, in this case you have a mother who is there for a custody hearing with her teenage daughter. And he sought them out. I mean, that was what was so sort of disturbing about this story. He sought them out. He asked the mother's permission to watch this girl, and that was how he made his initial contact with her. So we just felt that was so compelling that needed to be at the top. And you know, I think anecdotal leads can be clunky to pull off. Sometimes you think something's very interesting, but it doesn't actually illustrate the story. You know, there are a lot of reasons anecdotal leads don't work sometimes. You know, I'm glad we were able to execute this one.
Okay. So in two different approaches. I mean, as a reader, I was struck by how clean the language was in both of these stories and how easy it was to read them. And there's this website, Chartbeat, that measures reader engagement with stories, and I know that from last year for the top stories in 2017, the two of the Moore stories and the one Charlie Rose story, they're both in the top 40. One is at 26 and 28 for the Moore stories, and one is at 37 for the Rose story. So that means of all, I guess this is the readers worldwide of all the big stories last year from all media. I mean, you were connecting with readers who were spending a lot of time with your stories. So that's got to make you feel good, I would suspect.
Yeah, I mean, that's a metric that I think that I know as an investigative reporter we're really proud of, because we want people to stay and read from top to bottom. And sometimes I feel like in newspaper writing, there's such a tendency to kind of just dump all your facts in, and you know, the top of the story, and the top gets edited so much, and then you don't necessarily edit the bottom as much. But we also felt like we wanted the bottom of the story to be really strong, and we knew kind of what we were writing toward. We knew that we were going toward the ending, which was this anecdote from a young woman who had been called out to Charlie's house for a job interview. And she had later written kind of a fictionalized account of what had happened, and she referred to it as the hunt. And there's a quote from her saying, like, I was hunting for a job and he was hunting for me, you know, essentially. So we felt really strongly that we needed to take the readers on this kind of journey of what these women had experienced, and to see a metric like that and to know that people spent a lot of time on this story, that's really fulfilling for us as writers and reporters.
Okay. So we have about 15 more minutes here, and I want to ask you about one of the follow-up stories, the sting attempt on you guys, and then talk a little bit more about the impact. So, Beth, I was hoping you could set me up with this follow-up story, in which a woman approached you to try to tell a story about Roy Moore, hoping you would go with it, and then they could expose you guys as being sloppy reporters because the story was false. So give me a sense, what was that story? Then we're going to show a couple of clips from the Post's own videos on this.
So after the first story was published, I got an email from a woman. She identified herself at the time as Lindsay James, I believe. And she said, I have a Roy Moore story, but I'm very nervous about talking to a reporter. So I had suggested that we use an encrypted messaging app. So we started communicating on that. And right from the get-go, I was a little suspicious just because, she had reached out to me, but then was so, I could barely get anything out of her as to what happened, the nature of it. I wasn't sure where she was, and then all of a sudden she told me she was in New York and I needed to come to New York to interview her. Then I realized that she wasn't using her real name, and I said to her, look, I can't come to interview you if I don't even know your real name, and I just can't. So then she sort of came clean a little bit, gave me her real name, and then she said, well, I'm going to be in the Washington area. And I didn't understand, why was a woman who apparently had been taken advantage of in Alabama, why she was in New York, she was in Washington, all of these things raised red flags for me. And then she suggested that we meet at a mall that was actually very close to my house. So that was sort of another thing. And I literally said to my editor the night before, I really don't want to go to this interview. I'm almost sure it's a trap.
Yeah.
And he said, well, on the 2% chance that she has a real story to tell, you should go. So I went with my, guard up more than usual. And she told a story of how when she was a teenager, she had lived in Alabama for a summer with an aunt and met Roy Moore through their church, and he had impregnated her and then driven her to Mississippi, I think, to get an abortion. It was a pretty, astonishing story. And she was asking me, can you guarantee that if I come forward that this will ruin him? And of course, as reporters, we can never guarantee the outcome. We can only say, look, I think this is a very powerful story. Here's why I think you should tell it on the record. But anyway, and I also made it clear to her at that interview that, look, we're going to have to fact check everything that you're saying. I just want you to be aware of that. I'm going to have to call your aunt. I'm going to have to find out the name of the church, then determine whether Roy Moore did go to the church. So I kind of laid it all out. She said she would think about it. We were still communicating. She said she felt uncomfortable and uneasy, and I had a feeling that was because she hadn't elicited some sort of, inflammatory remarks that she was seeking to get. I mean, unfortunately, we've seen that happen before, where reporters are set up and they're baited into saying things that make them look biased. Mm-hmm. Thankfully, I had not done that. Through interviewing her, I did get a few details about her that we didn't know before. We got the actual name of her daughter. And with that information, a researcher back in the newsroom was able to find this fundraising page, GoFundMe page, where she was, hey, everybody, I'm going to be, trying to take down the liberal media. And so once we found that, we knew, okay, the 2% amount of doubt that I had was then erased. And that's when we decided to sort of turn the tables.
Okay, so we're actually going to show a clip from that. So your reporting partner, Stephanie McCrummen, she went to meet this woman, Jamie, at was it a mall food court? Or it was
at a diner.
At a diner.
Yeah.
And so we're going to show one clip and then another, and then a second brief clip. So this first clip is when Stephanie is basically saying, hinting at we're checking out, we're on to you. So let's watch that clip.
What that's about and why you would want to work for the Daily Caller. And I'm also, frankly want to know if you're, who you might be working for now.
I still do mortgage work.
Well, it's a little bit of an issue there, and I just want to ask you to explain it, because when we called the company that you said that you worked for, they said they didn't have, that you didn't work there.
Did you talk to the corporate office?
Beth made the phone call, and I know that she said that that they didn't have an employee by your name there.
Yeah.
Jamie.
Yeah, I'm not sure which office you called because there's a whole bunch all over the country.
Uh-huh.
So.
Okay. So, again, I want you to know that this is being recorded and video recorded. So if there's anything you want to say about why you're here and how you came to be sitting here, I really would like to know that story as well.
Okay, so that's Stephanie McCrumman basically saying we're recording you. We need to find out more about where you're coming from. Just before we show that second clip, tell me, who's the sandwich? What's the sandwich doing there in the front, in the foreground?
Even videographers get hungry.
Yeah.
But I just want
to. Those are two Washington. That's a Washington Post videographer who's sitting at the next table.
Yeah. I just want to say, I think this was a really courageous, bold move by the Washington Post. A lot of newspapers, I think, once they realized that somebody was trying to sell them a false story, would have just walked away from it. But our editors were like, go find out what's going on here. Who does this woman work for? What's behind this? So this was a really tough decision and a courageous one that we made. I don't think a lot of newsrooms would have made it. So as you saw there, Stephanie said, "Look, we're recording you. We're gonna air this. We're giving you a chance to respond." And then so let's go to the second clip where Stephanie brings up that GoFundMe page. So we're going to watch 20 seconds from that.
And are you in contact with other people? Are you in contact with the Roy Moore campaign or Steve Bannon or Breitbart or?
Not at all.
So did do you still have an interest in, as this says, combating the lies and deceit of the liberal MSM? Do you still have an interest in working in the conservative media movement to combat the lies and deceit of the liberal MSM? Is that still your interest?
No, not really.
Okay, so tell us. So who was behind this woman?
So we didn't learn that at this interview. She did not sort of fess up, but we started to kind of go on a hunch, which is now that we knew her real identity and we knew that she was a fraud, we figured out where she lived, and we realized that Project Veritas, an organization that is known for doing these kind of things, was located not very far from her house. So after that interview, a couple other reporters, went to her house and observed her drive. This was over Thanksgiving weekend. Drive that Monday morning from her home to Project Veritas, the headquarters, and watched her walk into the office. And that was the moment where we knew, she ostensibly, worked clearly for this organization. My colleague Aaron Davis talked to James O'Keefe right there in the parking lot.
And he's the head of Project
He's the head of it. So then that's when the whole story unraveled.
And so this is a great little investigative coup on this reverse sting that you all did. But it kind of goes to a larger issue of how careful do you have to be, when people are coming to you with stories that could be true but are 30, 35 years old. What kind of mindset do you have to be in to avoid being taken in by somebody who is trying to entrap you?
Unfortunately, I think as reporters, we have to operate that any email you send, you may see on the internet. Any conversation you have, you may end up hearing on the internet. We have to really be guarded, and that's going to be tough because as reporters, we of course want to develop rapport with our sources. That's key to be human, to make people feel comfortable. But I think there's a really careful balance you have to strike between making someone feel like they can open up to you, but without saying anything that would be used against you, in order to make the case that you were biased or on in the attack.
Okay. So how about, were you guys worried about people coming to you with false stories or just faulty stories that were based on bad memories?
In the aftermath of our initial reporting, when we had this influx of emails, There was one that I was skeptical of because it had a date in there about a supposed encounter that happened at Charlie's Long Island estate, and I knew from property records that he had not yet bought the estate at the time that the alleged encounter had occurred. So you're always looking for details. You know, you don't want to be some super skeptical person who doesn't trust anyone, but as reporters, our job is to try to figure out if information is true or not true. And there are steps that you can take to protect yourself. And I know that in watching how that Project Veritas situation unfolded, I mean, when I watched that video with Stephanie, even though I knew that it ended well for the Post, I was literally on the edge of my seat, like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe this is happening right now. And she was just such a pro in that encounter. But I think it taught our newsroom and hopefully other newsrooms like very valuable lessons, and that unfortunately we always need to be skeptical and operating, you know, with the highest level, I mean, of ethics. It goes back to what you're taught in journalism school, to always conduct yourself as a professional, but also in the course of our reporting, and especially tried to verify these allegations, you have to go about your job with a heightened level of scrutiny.
Okay, so are there any other for reporters out there who might be covering similar stories, sexual harassment stories, specifically, are there any resources out there, any organizations that kind of maybe track these issues, or organizations you can go to find out what maybe legal standards are state by state? I mean, both of your stories are kind of good source-driven investigative stories that happen to be about a sexual harassment issue. But are there any resources out there you could point reporters to who are doing these kind of stories?
I mean, I think you want to be aware of approaching people with sensitivity, you know, especially in these types of stories. You're dealing with some individuals who have buried their emotions and their experiences for a very long time. And it's difficult to walk the line with being very sensitive, but also being very demanding in what we're asking of them when it comes to producing, in some records, you know, receipts, travel schedules, anything to verify their stories. I know that there are different organizations out there who specialize in dealing with people who've been through traumatic experiences. Generally, I think if you conduct yourself with empathy and as a decent human being, you know, you can understand how you need to approach an interview like this. But that's what I would just recommend for individuals out there.
Okay, any general tips from you?
I mean, I would just encourage any reporters, you know, read these stories, read the Weinstein stories, read the stories about, you know, the doctor with the gymnasts. I mean, there's been, unfortunately, a procession of these stories that are all models of like how to report and how to write. And so I think the coverage over the last 2 years offers a lot of lessons for all of us.
Okay, so I want to close with it's another clip from I think this is from the first Charlie Rose story. So we're going to go to this clip in which CBS's Nora O'Donnell is discussing the issue. So let's go to that clip right now.
Gail, I know you and I have talked a lot about
Yes,
this,
we
and
have.
it takes a lot of courage for these women to come forward, and I think that they should continue to do something.
We hope that they will continue to speak up.
Yeah. I also want to say that this is a moment that demands a frank and honest assessment about where we stand and more generally the safety of women. Let me be very clear. There is no excuse for this alleged behavior. It is systematic and pervasive.
So she says this is a moment. I mean, that was roughly, I guess, 10 or 11 months ago. Is the country still experiencing this moment? Is the media still kind of aware of the moment and covering these issues? Or is the moment kind of come and gone?
I mean, I don't think you suddenly, you know, get out 50 years of behavior in a moment over a 3-month span. I think that it was a heightened moment, but I think that when it comes for a period of accountability and kind of truth, searching for the truth, that moment is continuing and will continue, I hope.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree. I think, unfortunately, there's a lot of stories yet to be told.
Okay. Well, I think that's all the time we have for now. I want to thank you both very much for coming to talk with us. Both of your stories, as I said, were just great examples of investigative reporting, and I'm very thankful for your time.
Thank
I
you.
want to thank you for joining us today from the Evelyn Y. Davis studios at the National Press Foundation, where we make good journalists better. Today we've heard from Amy Brittain and Beth Reinhard about their compelling and well-sourced stories about sexual harassment. Find more webinars and reporting resources at nationalpress.org and follow us on Twitter @NatPress.